go down the list of what they told the world they were going to do. They said, we're going to become the not just the leading manufacturer of these things, but the leading technology centers on these. Basically, 95% of the things came true. And if you look at the latest one, they're saying we're going to lead the world in AI. We're going to lead the world in quantum computing. We're going to lead the world in synthetic biology. Right. So all the things that we think only we can do, China is doing, and they're doing it at a scale and with like a public-private partnership industrial policy model that is producing results.
Hello, fellow data nerds. My guest today is Evan Smith. Evan is the co-founder and CEO of Altana, a global supply chain management platform. Altana is one of the newest freight tech unicorns out there. They recently raised $200 million in a Series C that valued the company over $1 billion. Evan, welcome to World of DaaS.
Thanks for having me. It's good to see you again.
Very excited. Yeah, great to see you as well. Now, you published a manifesto called Globalization 2.0 in 2022, a couple of years ago. Why do you think we're headed to a new phase of globalization now?
For a bunch of reasons, but the sort of summary is that the side effects and unintended consequences of globalization 1.0, which is like, call it 1945, accelerating from the 70s onward, and then really peaking in the 90s and early 2000s. That whole phase of global commerce was really fundamentally motivated by outsourcing, motivated by free trade, and motivated by the sort of financialization of the world economy and dollar hegemony. And so when you look at what's kind of breaking in the world right now, you've got the rise of China and a Thucydides trap where, great power competition is back. And that's playing out in the supply chain principally. You've got climate dislocation, right, where most of the carbon emissions are coming from that base of the supply chain, the raw material extraction, the processing of fossil fuels, the emissions of fossil fuels, land use change. That's playing out in the supply chain. And then you saw in the COVID shocks and then everything since that this whole, just-in-time supply chain, globally outsourced just-in-time supply chain is really only efficient under conditions of stability. And for reasons 1 and 2, and then subcategories of those things, the world is getting less and less stable. And so therefore the economy, the fabric of the economy, which is the supply chain, is getting
and what's going to happen there is the key thing there just redundancy? Okay, I need to have like 6 suppliers in case like 1 or 2 of them go offline, or is the key like onshoring or nearshoring, or what's the key to kind of keep things kind of moving?
I mean, the thing we're trying to realize in Altana and enable in Altana is think about it like virtual vertical integration. So it used to be the case that companies would control most of the value chain of the goods that they were making.
Yeah.
Ford had rubber plantations in Brazil in order to make tires, right? And now that would be crazy. So that whole wave of outsourcing, outsource the value chain. You don't need to own and control the whole thing. So I think the future looks like a visible and networked value chain where Ford can see all the way upstream. They can coordinate. They can collaborate. In some cases, you might want some redundancy of suppliers, but in other cases, you might want the ability to simply communicate, a change in forecast. So there's this famous thing in supply chain called the bullwhip effect. Picture a bullwhip cracking, with spikes and troughs and spikes and troughs and spikes and troughs. And that's because you can't coordinate supply and demand across multiple tiers of a value chain when you're not actually connected and coordinated and responding to events in real time. So even just the ability to have that active dialogue and that visibility across multiple tiers solves a lot of the problems. And then,
but do you think like we're gonna in the next 10 years will be more globalized, more interdependent, or less globalized and less interdependent?
Honestly, I think less. I think it's gonna stay. The logic of comparative advantage will persist, right? And I think what's almost certainly likely to happen is that global trade gets more and more oriented around blocks. There's going to be a Western trading bloc with bilateral and some multilateral trade agreements kind of factoring into them.
And the blocks are based on like alliances, or the blocks just based on proximity, like the U.S., Mexico, and Canada are super proximate to one another. So
it's going to be both, but principally on geopolitical dimensions.
Okay, so the U.S. there's a U.S.-China rivalry, so maybe it goes to U.S.-Vietnam or something like that, which might be more amenable to U.S. working or something. Okay,
right. And so you're seeing, bilateral trade deals, multilateral trade deals get crafted to, the headlines are around economic resilience. The headlines are around ESG, sustainability, carbon, labor rights. But I think the underlying drivers of those policies are principally geopolitical.
Now, there's been a lot of like opacity in the supply chain. Who's benefited the most from that opacity?
Yeah, middlemen, right? Like brokers and middlemen in the whole sourcing supply chain world.
It's like the Mark Rich of the world, like those types of people.
That's one version of it, but just to give you a narrow but still huge version of it, in the textile and apparel industry, there's this type of business called a textile converter, and their job is to sit between the mills who make stuff and the brands who don't want to deal with the mills.
Okay, so there's all these different mills in Bangladesh or something like that, and then there's the Gap who's making the T-shirts, and they're going to help you negotiate all the things with.
So in any market where there's opacity, you've got people who can step in as brokers, and there's information arbitrage, there's price arbitrage. So that's one. A lot of middlemen. Li and Feng, right? That's like one of the biggest middlemen on earth, built up around sourcing from Asia. So that's one. I think there was an early adopter benefit to supply chain opacity in terms of outsourcing. So if you were early in outsourcing, you were able to drive down your prices, your working capital requirements, and
you're talking about outsourcing of physical goods, not necessarily outsourcing of call centers or something like that.
I think it kind of applies to both, right?
Okay.
So there's this sort of, the game theory is like you go first and you get it working, and then you can reduce your costs relative to your competitors more quickly. You can take more market share, and it has this sort of spiral. And that lasted for, call it 20 years. It still is happening in different geographies, right? There's a sort of efficiency seeking benefit. But that, like, the thing that underpins that, right, is this opacity and the ability to arbitrage costs. And then the third category of who benefited is honestly just bad actors. So transnational criminal organizations, that's TCOs and kind of government speak. It includes terrorism. It includes the cartels. It includes ransomware, hackers. So it's kind of the umbrella term for transnational, meaning not necessarily state sponsored, but jurisdictions spanning criminal enterprises. And those certainly have blossomed and flourished in the underbelly of globalization.
Assuming like think of a bad actor that would flourish would be maybe like one that employs child labor or bad labor standards or something like that, because it'd be very hard to know if you're like
human
the
trafficking, right?
Fourth tier supplier or something.
Totally. Yeah. So it's human traffickers, narcotics traffickers. It's frankly, like the whole money laundering circuit associated with terror finance. So opacity benefits those enterprises. And I read something about a year ago that said the scale of transnational crime is about 10% of global GDP.
That makes sense.
Yeah, checks out.
Now, with the rise of AI, where do you think it hits? Like, you'd think it would hit countries like the Philippines or India quicker, and maybe could hurt them, could help them, but maybe hurt them faster, because a lot of the things that we outsource to India or the Philippines, whether it be a call center or something like that, or things like maybe AI could do quicker than things we outsource to a China or a Bangladesh or something, where maybe AI is not going to be like making t-shirts anytime soon.
I think it's going to be a mixed bag. What we're seeing in the kind of, I'll stick to supply chain, right? So yes, the sort of call center, the low grade sort of customer service stuff, that's clearly going to go the way of AI.
Yeah. Do you think like the place like the Philippines seems like particularly like they might get hurt really quickly?
I think that's likely. Yeah. And then, you look at the sort of knowledge work in the West, and it's hard to see that not getting meaningfully disrupted.
Yep.
Right. What do you need? What do you need these management consultants for? What do you need these business analysts for? Do you need as many developers as you used to? So I think the productivity gains are going to be profound, but the labor market dislocation is going to be profound as well. And then I think it's going to be all over the place. And then what's getting interesting is robotics. I saw a demo 2 weeks ago that blew my mind.
Yeah.
So it's hard to imagine, 5 years from now that there aren't really, really capable sort of multi-skill learning robots in manufacturing environments.
Okay, so therein lies, there could be some ways of, if there's something that's very labor intensive or something like that, and that's the reason you moved it to another country. Maybe you can move it to back to the U.S. or something like that if you had robots. Sometimes the problem isn't just the labor; it's the know-how and other types of things of being able to make, or being near other suppliers that are making, and you just have to like be transporting things. So these things are sometimes are very hard to move.
It's often very hard to move. Yeah, you're tied to skilled labor, you're tied to input constraints, you're tied to logistics constraints, right? Everyone's trying to move manufacturing to India right now, and the ports and rails just don't support it.
Yep.
So you can make stuff, but you can't get things in and out of the country at a efficient enough rate.
And India is a big place too. It's like the U.S. is a really big place. It's like you kind of really want like a manufacturing hub in like one tiny area of the country, so that like it kind of worked back in the day in like the 1920s with the cars. They're all like in the Detroit area. Right. All the suppliers were in that area. They all kind of like worked with one another. So you kind of want everybody in like, I don't know, in the Alabama basin or something, and you want to just have all the ports there and all the other it's spreading out does make it more difficult.
China did it. China did it really well with the SEZs, the special economic zones.
Yep.
And like Shenzhen, it's a one-stop shop and a few hundred mile radius where all of the consumer electronics, kind of cheap toy stuff was happening, and then it kind of went up the value chain into more and more advanced electronics. But it's all there, and so you have everything from like circuit boards and batteries to cameras to the injection molding. So the whole drone complex that's built up, like they've got a lead that's I can't imagine anybody catching up to.
One of the problems in the U.S. is that politically, you kind of have to spread things out. You got to give this state over here this and this other state, and because you've got a lot of different political masters, where like maybe it would make sense to have like a special economic zone in one place and really, really kind of concentrate everything, and maybe change the regulations of that place or change the incentives. Or could you ever imagine something like that happening in the U.S.?
I can imagine. I mean, the logic is there. I think it's a no-brainer. We should be doing that. This is such a special interest economy. It's unless there's a big enough special interest that's able to go do that. Maybe it's the commercial aerospace industry in Texas, for example, and they can pull something like that off.
But Give us a sense of like China's transition from kind of globalization 1.0 to globalization 2.0.
So they've been everything I'm about to say is not necessarily a values judgment, right? It's not like an us versus them, but just sort of an observation of the behavior. So they've been admitted into like the rules based, WTO, Western sort of global trade framework for about 25 years now, and what they've done systematically is not follow the rules and exploit the system to their own benefit from an industrial policy standpoint.
And they've also been very good at just like whether it be like the WTO or the World Bank, or they've been very good at inserting themselves there, getting policies that are in their best interest. Very good at lobbying other countries. I would say probably significantly, they've probably done a significantly better job than the U.S. has over the last 20 years.
The U.S. was resting on its laurels, right?
Yeah.
And the prevailing kind of political ideology, whether it was neoconservatives or neoliberals, they all read, Thomas Friedman and Fukuyama and decided that, capitalism and free trade were going to create peaceful democracies all around the world. So China took advantage of that mindset. They went on offense, and we said, well, they're sort of misbehaving, but they're small and they're just making toys and cheap stuff. And like they'll come around because markets will compel democracy and therefore we'll all be in peaceful trade. And obviously that didn't happen, and they were playing to win. And now there's a sort of zero sum geopolitical calculus, which is, I think, updating some economic calculus, right? Like economics is inherently a positive sum game. The more you trade, the more you exchange, the more you specialize, there's more sort of productivity and output of the system. And I think geopolitics is zero sum. It's a Hobbesian power struggle. And so China was playing a zero sum game while we were sort of an economically motivated,
and by the way, it's, if you look at let's say the last 15 years or so, the U.S. comparatively to most of the world has done incredibly well. Like as a percentage of GDP in the world, it's still roughly the same. It's probably gone up a bit. The area that has done the worst over those last 15 years has been Europe. Like they've been completely decimated. As a percentage of GDP 15 years ago, they were roughly the same as the US.
Yeah.
Now they're not even in like close proximity anymore. It's like a lesser, more backward place almost. Like what happened in those 15? Like, is it really just the rise of the US, or is it just like the demise of Europe? Like what's the story? If you're enjoying this podcast, please sign up for our newsletter. Go to worldofdas.com. The link is in the description below. Now back to the video.
I think it's both. Within Europe, you had you used to have a labor market and a supply chain arbitrage that actually enabled pretty competitive European manufacturing within like European value chains, right?
Yep.
So you had lower cost labor to the east and the south, and then higher order manufacturing, higher value manufacturing and output, the further north you went. And that became less true over time as, the response to the financial crisis and all the interventions, market interventions, just the sort of normal course of trade, travel, and incomes rising. So that sort of structural value chain advantage to Europe has gone away. They loaded themselves up with debt that they can't work through, and the response to the banking crisis in 2008 and 2009, has created sort of a mini Japan, where there's just a ton of deflationary pressure from a credit standpoint, and then regulation. So I'm not going to get the quote right, but Europeans are the first to regulate in any new technology or any new innovation. And
Yeah, and they have also
AI,
they
no
have high
exception, right?
energy prices and other
Right.
such things, right?
So there's these sort of like technocratic interventions that are well intentioned, but just have these pretty consistent negative economic consequences.
It's an interesting thing where, like, I bet you every single person in Taiwan like knows everything about TSMC. If you ask just like a random cab driver or something like that, they could probably tell you all these different things about TSMC. I was with my family a few months ago in Amsterdam,
Yeah.
and we went to the Van Gogh Museum. We had this great tour guide who kind of took us through it and everything. And there's an area of the Van Gogh Museum which says it's sponsored by ASML.
Mm-hmm.
And I was telling my kids about ASML and why it's such an amazing company. The tour guide had never heard of ASML.
Whoa.
Like it like literally had never even heard about it, even though it's like the most important company by far in the Netherlands,
Europe.
and one of the most important companies outside of a couple of biotech companies in Europe.
It's ARM and ASML, right? Like,
yeah.
What else is there?
Yeah, exactly. There's a few other kind of if you want to beat diabetes or something like that, you've got a few good ones, right?
Sure.
Right. So there's a few other kind of very good
There's
companies
some biotech
there.
Leadership.
Yeah. But like I was very surprised that this is a woman who had like a PhD, very smart, was a great tour guide, like really knew her Van Gogh like incredibly well. But yet had like literally never heard about it. And so somehow it's just not being like celebrated or being pervaded in a place like that.
And they're all patting each other on the back for being the first to regulate AI.
Yeah, exactly. Now, what you kind of mentioned this, but this kind of like there's been, back in the 90s, there was this like end of history, golden arches theory, philosophy that trade would bring peace and democracy. Like,
right.
Of course, a lot of people pick through this thing, but like, what's your estimation of why that didn't work out? Like at the time, I remember being a young person at the time and hearing about that, and it seemed to make a lot of sense, 20, 25 plus years ago.
Me too. I came out of Yale in 2007 with an econ degree, so like a neoliberal stamp on my back, and went out into the world. So why didn't it work out? I think at the highest level, it's what I said earlier. I think I've come to the worldview that geopolitics is inherently a zero-sum game, just relative power struggle.
Yep.
And economics is a positive-sum game. And in the 90s, we sort of got our causality wrong, right? We thought that free trade had created peace.
Mm-hmm.
And what had really occurred was that peace through a unipolar, U.S. hegemony. And
if you have like one
security umbrella,
it's the Peter Zeihan. Okay, the U.S. was already like patrolling all the seas. We made it really easy to move things. No pirates, no whatever. Then we can have lots of trade.
And so, So the U.S. provides a security umbrella. They guarantee the security of the supply chain and of global trade. And then you really saw nation state conflict. Besides like the Balkans and a couple of things here and there, conflict between nation states for about 13, 15 years was pretty close to zero. And so everyone was in this sort of euphoria, the end of history, and, free trade did it. And we're in a system of mutual benefit. That was true of the economy. It just wasn't true of the geopolitics. So I think that's kind of the main thing. And then the other one is, if you're an economist and you're looking at the logic of free trade over the appropriate time frame, it's pretty unassailable. If you're looking at free trade through the lens of social stability and economic security, we made some pretty big mistakes. So the hollowing out of the industrial base in the West was a major error.
Yep.
And we can talk about the vulnerabilities that it creates, but I think what it's done politically is give rise to the populism in the West, where there's sort of a working class revolt against the elites, and it's deserved, right? It was a sort of bipartisan elite issue, and go to Ohio.
It was there was both like a like a neoliberalism kind of ethos that pervaded. But do you think there was at the same time a little bit of kind of like inside dealing as well, where
100%. Yeah.
yeah, okay, yeah,
Yeah. I mean, it
and
benefits.
obviously bipartisan. This is
Yeah. This is
Clintonian
not a
and
partisan
George
statement at
W.
all.
Bushian, and
Yep.
yes,
Yep. Through the Obama administration,
yeah,
Obama bought the whole Clinton economic brain trust with him, and so yeah, that was the worldview. And then the elites were doing extraordinarily well, right? So you had about 40 years of inflation adjusted median wage stagnation in the United States, and everybody below the 90th percentile was either flat or declining in terms of their inflation adjusted wages. And everybody above that was soaring.
Yep.
And then the owners of assets and of financial assets or physical assets.
Yeah, if you're in the S&P 500,
period,
and you had a decent amount of your net worth in the S&P 500, that was great.
Right. So if you were in the elite, then that was the best time to be alive. But like I said, the side effects and unintended consequences of that globalization are now sort of here with us, and it's in our politics, it's in our geopolitics, it's in our climate.
Yep. Yeah, it's interesting. And in some ways, the U.S. today is still, in some ways, maybe the most globalized it's ever been. The immigration rate is still incredibly high in the U.S. Right. Probably as a percentage of immigrants in the U.S. It's about as high as it's ever been, at least in the last maybe 150 years or so. There's all these other things are still it's still a very, very globalized place. But your kind of contention is maybe it'll still be fairly globalized, but just less globalized in the future.
I think it's going to turn into values and geopolitically aligned blocks, and there'll be trade between them. So it's not going to be strict, hermetically sealed economies. But it seems pretty obvious that the world is fracturing.
And we're seeing this kind of shift, as you mentioned earlier, from these kind of big multilateral trade deals to much more bilateral or maybe trilateral kind of trade deals. Yep. Based on the data that you've seen, is this starting to affect the global supply chains? And so how is it affecting it?
It is, but if you think about supply chains as a supplier selling goods to a buyer, and then the logistics connecting them, then things are changing profoundly. Yeah. Meaning, refrigerators aren't coming from China; they're now coming from Mexico, right? As they come into the United States.
Yeah.
If you think of the supply chain network in terms of the value chains, so in other words, where do the component parts of the refrigerator come from? Where's the magnets? Where's the heating coil? Where's the heat exchange? And then upstream of that, where does the PVC come from? Where's the aluminum come from? And upstream of that, what are the mines? So what really isn't changing are those value chains.
Yeah.
At least not quickly. What is changing is the country of final assembly in response to these bilateral trade deals. And then, policymakers are starting to get hip to this and saying okay, it's not enough to say that
it can't just be made in Mexico. It actually there's all these other kind of
the
downstream
content,
things.
The value chain of the refrigerator needs to actually have USMCA or non-Chinese content in order to be in this tariff.
But it's very hard. I mean, if you have there are these factories in China, they'll create a fake factory in Vietnam. They'll kind of push all the stuff there. Yeah, it costs more now. You have to move it all by rail to Vietnam or something. So now, okay, we've increased the cost by 10%, and then we ship it out of there, and we just call it Vietnam.
Exactly. So what these bilateral and sort of economic security oriented trade deals are doing right now is lengthening the value chains. They're making them longer and more expensive, but they're not fundamentally reshaping the value chains yet. And so this is a big area of policy where if policymakers are serious about solving this, they need to be regulating the entire value chain. An example of that is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act.
Yeah.
So that's where the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency now has to stop all goods coming into the United States if they have their upstream origin in the Xinjiang province in China. So it's sort of like guilty until proven innocent.
Yep.
And that's where they're actually regulating the entire value chain and telling the private sector, you have to prove dispositively that there's no forced labor, like Uyghur slave labor, associated with these genes, with this automobile, with these pharmaceuticals.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's incredibly difficult to do.
So that's I think the direction of travel on policy is it's going to be a lot more of these value chain style regulations and not merely just, I want my refrigerators made in Mexico.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was this great map of like trade of France with other countries, let's say like in the Russian orbit, and post the sanctions on Russia. Obviously, the trade between France and Russia went down dramatically, but it correspondingly went up almost the exact same amount with like Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, et cetera. And so clearly, like, it's just like moving the goods between different 100%. Places, but the goods are still moving. Now, maybe it does impose a cost on Russia because now they have to pay 10% more for those goods or something because it's harder to go. But there's the goods still get there.
Yeah, it's pretty obvious that the theory that we were going to carve Russia out of the world economy and that their military industrial base would grind to a halt, that didn't work.
Yeah, it's clearly like these things are like not working at all.
Right.
Like their economy's humming, and it doesn't. Yeah, right. It feels like it's very, very difficult to do. We live in a very porous world, and there's a lot of people, companies, and countries that have incentives to cheat.
Yeah, I mean, you're singing my tune. I mean, unless you're modeling these products and these business networks as value chains, where you can really see those multi-tier connections through all the components, then you're not going to solve these kinds of problems, right? There was a drone that got shot down in Ukraine like a week ago. It was made in North Korea, and it had United States and French technology in the drone.
Yeah.
So, in spite of the sanctions, in spite of the export controls, they're still working their way through the global networks to provide, the cameras, the targeting systems, the onboard logic.
Yeah, exactly. Now, this is a data podcast, World of DaaS. I'd love to ask you some data questions. Like, what type of data sets do you think are most relevant to supply chain questions?
Transactional data sets. Right. So you need to see the sender, the receiver, the nature of the goods being transacted.
The SKUs even. And
the more the merrier, but fundamentally transactional. So it's way less interesting to say that Foxconn is a supplier to Apple than it is to say, last month at these locations, these subsidiaries of Foxconn sold these goods at these volumes to this subsidiary of Apple, and here was the trade lane, and here was the logistics provider that moved the goods. So we operate on billions of transactional records, purchase orders, commercial invoices, customs declarations, cargo manifests, bills of lading, and that's the good stuff.
I mentioned that data is like very, very dirty, right? Mm-hmm. Every probably supplier has done it in a different way, or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there are some like is there some sort of like tricks or way of cleaning or normalizing the data?
Yeah, we started the company 6 years ago and built our own deep learning driven entity resolution. So like the data cleaning, the normalization, the resolution where you connect the dots across all the data.
Yeah.
And in the LLM world, that's all getting supercharged and enhanced. So the short answer is it's very messy stuff. It's in different languages. Sometimes it's handwritten. We were just talking about goods descriptions. We'll see stuff that says 20 tons of cucumbers or 20 cartons of cucumbers. Call Orrin Hoffman when you get to the port and reference this by email to Evan Smith. And here's Orrin's phone number, and here's an address for the shipment company to come pick it up. And that's all in the goods description.
Yeah, so you don't even know how much is in a carton or how big the cucumbers are.
Right. So you've got to, and everything I said is in Cyrillic.
Yep.
So that's kind of the data wrangling challenge. And to do that at the scale of billions of records, you couldn't do this with humans. You couldn't do it with traditional or historical systems for like data cleaning, data management. So it's only in an AI world where you can start to make sense of this stuff at scale.
Interesting. How do you think about like ship movement data, like the AES data and stuff like that? Like, is that valuable?
To some use cases, yeah. If you want to look at like money laundering, transshipment, narcotics trafficking, stuff like that, and that's Iran, Russia. How are they exporting
Yep.
their oil products to the world? That's all through transshipment. So you see like uh, a Western vessel or some international vessel that's not on the bad guy list turn off their transponder, disappear from the map for like a week, come back on, and then you kind of look across the data and you see that the Iranian oil tanker was on its way to go meet it in the middle of the Indian Ocean. So there's stuff like that. But
for things that are like moving in like different ways, obviously you have digital goods that are moving constantly. You've got maybe like pipelines that are moving kind of certain types of goods and stuff like that. I imagine those are like much more difficult to track.
You do see in pipelines, you can actually get transaction records. You don't see.
Yeah, I guess the pipelines, each country takes a piece, right?
Yeah,
so if the pipeline goes through 4 different countries, they'll all have incentive to monitor it.
Yeah, it's hard to make sense of that. And then digital transactions, depending on the countries, like a lot of Latin America has actually created they have individually as nations created public databases of their invoices and their value-added tax receipts. So basically, you can go get at that data and build a transactional picture of local economies. Now, there's a lot of like fraud and sort of abuse of those systems, but you can see a lot in the digital space there, and kind of see inside of the country's economies and not just what they're doing across borders.
What are some of the more surprising insights that can be uncovered from supply chain data that maybe like contradicts common assumptions about global trade?
I'll give you one off the top of my head. I think the common assumption about China is that they're really only making cheap stuff that's not very sophisticated, and that the West and the US in particular has this big technology advantage on China. And that is so not true anymore.
Yeah. They are definitely one of the most sophisticated manufacturing powerhouses, as sophisticated as Germany, right?
They release, a 5-year economic plan every 5 years. And the last one said, we're going to become the world leader in solar, in batteries, in electric vehicles.
Yeah, you look at BYD. Their cars are incredible.
And so you go down the list of what they told the world they were going to do. They said, we're going to become the not just the leading manufacturer of these things, but the leading technology centers on these. And basically 95% of the things came true. And if you look at the latest one, they're saying we're going to lead the world in AI, we're going to lead the world in quantum computing, we're going to lead the world in molecular or in synthetic biology. Right. So all the things that we think only we can do, China is doing, and they're doing it at a scale and with like a public-private partnership industrial policy model that is producing results. Now, I think they're set up structurally for some major turbulence, and it's already happening. But they're doing what they said they were going to do.
And if you're like a U.S. policymaker, and you think of China as a competitor, it's a very good competitor. It's like competing with the New York Yankees or the Kansas City Chiefs or something like that. Like, they're very, very smart at what they do. Like, what can we be doing to compete better with them?
So I tend to agree with the kind of Silicon Valley argument that we're not going to out-centralize China.
Yep.
Right. So if you play the game on top-down command and control, state planning,
CHIPS Act
industrial policy
stuff or whatever.
That's tough. So our edge is our innovation, our labor market that attracts the best people from all over the world.
Yep.
And our political system, which is capable of absorbing new facts and circumstances and updating itself, with pain, but it happens.
Yep.
So I think we have to lean into those advantages in order to compete here. Now that said, especially around economic security, I think there are, and I wrestle with this because I think my personal politics are, if anything, pretty libertarian, and as I've kind of seen these things play out, I've processed it. We do a lot of our work in this space. It's hard to have any other response to mercantilism, which is what the Chinese are engaged in, right? Than some protective counter response, right? So we've seen what happens when you just sort of don't respond for 25 years, right? Like they subsidize their industries, they build tremendous export capacity, they're dumping goods on the world at an unprecedented scale, and all these distortions in the trade balance, world economy, the financial markets, everything that ensues. And I think the sort of, wouldn't it be nice if we all just did free trade and let the market do what it's supposed to do? Doesn't work when you've got somebody that big and that deliberate, exploiting that system. So there does need to be an economic security response, and it's showing up on things.
But just going back, it's like part of the reason that China is so effective is that they do what they say they're going to do. Totally. They're going to go build a massive, super high speed train. They just go do it, and they do it effectively, and it's a good train. Or they build a highway or whatever. In the U.S.'s case, if you just think of all the promises that we've made over the last 15 years, the broadband, the CHIPS Act, all these different things, like the whatever high-speed train in California, whatever we've promised, like we haven't delivered on. We haven't had, for whatever reason, the will or the system in place to get these things done. So how do we actually compete if we can't actually do what we say we're going to do?
I think our private sector is the best in the world.
It's just, so it's almost a decentralized approach to it, like letting the flowers bloom.
You got to let the flowers bloom, but I think you got to put some guardrails on the market. So I think the U.S. is pretty.
These are like
bad.
Trade restrictions or other types of guardrails.
Right. So I think the U.S. is pretty bad at industrial policy, like the CHIPS Act.
Yeah.
What have we seen so far?
Likely is not going to be a very good investment. Yeah. So
that is not our unique and special talent, right? That's China's unique and special talent. I think what we can do is out innovate anybody in the world, and we can attract private capital to those innovations, like SpaceX, right? And so it's really about how do you shape the trade and financial market conditions and restrictions, frankly, in a way that advantages that innovation-based economy and protects against the systematic abuse of it.
What these trade restrictions are interesting. It's probably the most bipartisan issue today in the U.S. is more trade restrictions. Kind of like anti-China is probably the most bipartisan kind of thing. Where do you think that kind of like that consensus? Sometimes when we've had this type of consensus in America in the past, it hasn't always been a good thing. Maybe the neoliberalism consensus of 20 years ago. How do you think that manifests itself over the next decade?
So a cynical, but I think ultimately kind of optimistic worldview that I have is that humans are just fundamentally a tribal species, where our ability to cohere in larger and larger groups in pursuit of like basically joint survival strategies depends on having an external threat. Like, so we're kind of hardwired to have an us versus them, good versus evil competitive dynamic in order to come together as a tribe and into larger and larger groups. And like, and I've said, if aliens showed up and started orbiting Earth, the U.S. and China would be best friends working to protect ourselves, right? So I think the bipartisan consensus on trade it stems from that. Like, so we're now in a geopolitical circumstance where there's a genuine peer competitor. They're trying to build a world order that is fundamentally different than the one that we believe in, right? It's different values, it's different orientation. And that's a zero-sum competition. And so, I think everyone's woken up to that threat and that challenge. And, whether it's on the right or the left, they see the border as, and sort of financial markets, the border, industrial policy, economic security policies as the way to respond. And then obviously there's a rapid effort to try to reindustrialize and frankly, like militarize.
Now, a couple personal questions. You're from Homer, Alaska, which I think is maybe a 4 or 5 hour drive south of Anchorage. Yep. What is it like to grow up there? You don't meet as many people from Alaska around here.
I describe Homer as, literally the end of the road. It's as far as you can drive on Highway 1. You kind of come through the interior of Alaska into Anchorage, and then you drive down and it spits you out onto the bay in Homer. And a lot of the people that showed up there were people who were looking to get away. And so it had this character of, outsiders, kind of on the libertarian spectrum or the hippie spectrum, mm-hmm. and people who are really trying to get away from government, from traumas, from whatever it was.
Yeah.
So I think there were, maybe a few hundred people that lived there in the late 70s, and then a few thousand people showed up in their, 20s and 30s and kind of took the town over. So it's got this really vibrant, outcast, end of the road, quirky vibe. And my experience there was, I didn't fit in at all. Like that town spit me out like an immune response. Ton of conflict with a number of coaches and teachers and principals. Not all of them. I had some amazing relationships, but
is it just like the classic entrepreneur has conflict anywhere, or is it more like, what is it about this kind of iconoclast place that you had conflict with?
I think, so the honest answer is, like with now that I'm almost 40 and I kind of look back on it as an adult with a kid, like I think a lot of the adults in that town were just kind of struggling with insecurity and drama, and
that's why they moved there in the first place.
Right. And so, and then I was a kid who, was a top athlete, a top student, and I was pretty high profile. And it was just sort of like, it was very frictionful to grow up there.
Interesting.
And so, I didn't belong there. I left. I got to school out here on the East Coast, and I didn't belong there. Even though I looked, waspy and I looked the part, but and then that's kind of been my life experience. Outsider and insider's clothing. And I see Altana the same way. I see our business that way. It's like
what is it like to spend the winters in Homer, Alaska?
I thought it was awesome.
Okay. Cool.
But going back now where there's 4 hours of daylight, and the sun's low on the horizon, that gets pretty oppressive. But you don't know any better as a kid when you grow up in it. So I love the winter. We had snowmobiles, and we would be out by ourselves in the woods, getting the snowmobile stuck at like 8 p.m. pre-cell phones. My parents have no idea where we are. We're 10 miles away, and we're 10 years old. Like, so the freedom and the sense of adventure was.
It's an outdoorsy place, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Totally.
All right, two more other question we ask all of our guests. What is a conspiracy theory that you believe?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a conspiracy theory anymore. It was a conspiracy theory when I believed it. The lab leak.
Yeah, now it's like it's not. Now everyone believes it.
Now it's
now it almost be almost conspiracy theory not to believe it, right?
pretty
At this
fucking
point.
obvious what happened. But no, I was convinced.
Well, unclear why there's still conspiracies around the lab leak. Like, was it intentional? Was it not intentional? Was all these other types of things? But now I'd say most people probably do believe that.
And for what it's worth, I'm in the accidental lab leak. I don't think it's a bioweapon.
Yeah. I kind of feel that way too. Yeah.
But yeah, I was sort of vocal about
on that one. It was
March
interesting where, like, at first it was a conspiracy theory, and you weren't if you like put it out on the internet, you'd get like our YouTube or something, you'd get like censored. You couldn't even say it for a while.
Deplatformed. Right? You were harming public safety.
And then like just something happened. It was like this like Jon Stewart kind of meme where he mentioned it somewhere, and it was almost like he just said like obvious stuff. He was just saying like, well, isn't this and then like all of a sudden it just like broke, and then like the New York Times was like all writing about it like the next day.
There's an outbreak of delicious chocolatey goodness in Hershey, Pennsylvania.
Right.
Was it because a bat flew from Texas and like smooched a pangolin and gave rise to a chocolate outbreak?
It's interesting because like historically there's been this kind of role for the court jester who can almost say these truths that no one else is allowed to say, and then people then can accept it, and almost that's what the role that he played in that sense.
I agree with you. Not to get political, but you just what that sparked in my mind was like Donald Trump was kind of that with respect to China, right? It was
exactly.
Kind of wild.
Like he said the stuff that like now everyone believes that, right? But in 2016, it was a little bit more heretical,
right?
Okay, last question we ask all of our guests. What conventional wisdom or advice do you think is generally bad advice?
You might disagree with me on this one. As a seed stage investor and entrepreneur, I think it's bad advice to focus on a narrow problem and try to build a product and business around that.
Okay. For everybody, or just for like a massive company or something like that? Yeah.
Look, it's probably not for everybody. It's not like a universal thing. But I think unless you're happy to just kind of do something as a services business and solve a narrow problem,
just like for like a venture funded kind of company, you don't want it too narrow.
Yeah. Let's narrow it to the venture world. So for a venture funded company, the conventional wisdom is, get an MVP on some narrow problem you can solve with a workflow and then grow from there. And I think, both from a technology standpoint, like solving small problems in a world of AI is not super defensible. Like I think people are going to solve their own small problems. And I think building for scale requires having a vision for the thing at scale. And it permeates everything from like your data model to your go-to-market to your capitalization.
But you do learn things over time, right? Like you're building something, a customer uses it, you're like, oh, actually, I built it the wrong way. Or like, if you just try to build like the final product,
this isn't like
$400 million of capital or something.
100%. This isn't like go into a hole for 4 years and come up with the magic thing and then do the big reveal. Like you still have to come in contact with reality. You've got to iterate. You got to get customer feedback. But if the vision for the thing and if the problem you're trying to solve is super narrow, I just don't think we live in a world anymore where solving narrow problems is going to create a lot of value.
And is it because it's just not big enough, or it's because like you feel like if I solve that narrow problem, like am I smart enough to move to the next problem and then the next one?
There's going to be some percentage of people who do that thing, kind of the conventional wisdom. But like look at the App Store post iPhone. So the early app developers that did a niche thing, okay, great, but then that gets competed away, and now there's a gazillion. And so the pace of innovation, the ease of software development, especially in an AI world, and everything is changing. It's like,
but you sometimes, if you just think of like Stripe or something or Twilio, like they initially solved a very, very narrow problem. And then it's like, oh, okay, like I'll move to like the slightly adjacent problem to that. I'll move to the slightly adjacent thing. And then
but I think
like
the Stripe guys kind of make my point, where it was like they actually had a vision for a world scale platform. They weren't just like trying to solve a checkout experience.
sure. But I don't know that the today's Stripe would match the vision. Like I'm sure it's changed quite a bit, dramatic. I mean, obviously they're like, I think that the value of Stripe is that part of the value was they solved a narrow problem, but they had two of the most extraordinary entrepreneurs who were solving that problem, and then they were very smart about moving to the adjacent things. And yeah, if you didn't have the Carlson brothers, then yeah, they would have just end up with like a cool little company. But because they're so smart and ambitious and curious people, they're able to kind of move. And Twilio was, I think, similar, where they kind of solved something very, very narrow. And the CEO doesn't get as much credit, but he kept like moving to other kind of things that are slightly adjacent, made it easier and easier and easier all the way. And that kind of changed, especially in that world where it moved to mobile. He made it much easier to do that. Plaid was something very similar, where they're solving these very narrow, we have these scrapers that are in there. And then they kept like, again, like great CEO who's able to really, founding team who's able to kind of move there. So yeah, but yes, they were ambitious, but maybe not everyone like is like, okay, we're going to Mars like Elon Musk or something.
Yeah, look, I
guess it depends also your definition of it too. Yeah,
like look at Anduril in the defense space. Like the to me, the majority of the big value creating things are going to be in the tech landscape as it exists today are going to be highly ambitious from day one. OpenAI, right? Like,
yep.
And there will be exceptions to this, obviously, and the whole reason I'm saying it is because it's not conventional wisdom.
Yeah, it's interesting. But really, what you're saying is you got to go raise a lot of money,
or you have to have a real point of view on scale and on solving hard problems that are tough to compete away.
Yep. Yeah. It's also makes it easier to attract super talented people, because super talented people want to do something really big and really exciting. And sometimes they're just like, well, I don't want to just do this little thing and, reduce costs by 10% or something or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. All right. This has been amazing. Thank you, Evan Smith, CEO of Altana, for joining us on World of DaaS. I follow you on LinkedIn. I know you're not on like X or most of the other interwebs, but I follow you on LinkedIn. I definitely encourage our listeners to engage with you there. This has been a ton of fun.
Yeah, Oren, you are and have always been a thought leader and a really amazing convener of discussions, and it's super cool to be able to do this with you.
Awesome. Thank you.
And if you're a super data nerd, go to worldofdaas.com. That's DAAS, worldofdaas.com, and sign up for our weekly Data as a Service News Roundup newsletter.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, consider rating this podcast and leaving a review. For more World of DaaS, and DaaS is DAAS, you can subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or anywhere you get your podcasts. And also check out YouTube for videos. You can find me at Twitter at Oren, that's AUREN, Oren, and we'd love to hear from you.